tonight I'd like to welcome our third speaker in this series, Paul D. Miller, also known as DJ Spooky, That Subliminal Kid. Paul is a friend and a conceptual artist, writer, and musician. His new book, Rhythm Science, will be published by MIT Press next month, in April. Rhythm Science is a manifesto in which Paul describes how artists use technology to arrange the mix of cultural ideas and objects that bombard us. His written work has appeared in lots of publications: The Village Voice, The Source, Artforum, Raygun, Rap Pages, Paper Magazine. The list is pretty long. He is also a co-publisher, along with the legendary African-American downtown poet Steve Cannon of the magazine A Gathering of the Tribes, a periodical dedicated to new works by writers from a multicultural context. And he was the first editor-at-large of Artbyte, the magazine of digital culture, a magazine that is unfortunately now defunct. Currently, he is in the middle of starting another magazine with many of the more progressive aspects of the Artbyte project. This new magazine is on the way. Stay tuned for further development.
I just did.
Every time you move, I can hear it rubbing against your shirt.
At lots of museums and other kinds of art venues, including biennials, Venice Biennial for Architecture, the Ludwig Museum in Cologne in Germany, and the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, to name just a few. Paul's most well known under the moniker of his constructed persona, DJ Spooky, That Subliminal Kid, which is a character from his upcoming novel, Flow My Blood, the DJ said, that uses a wide variety of digitally created music as a form of postmodern sculpture. Paul has recorded a huge volume of music as DJ Spooky, That Subliminal Kid, and has collaborated with a wide variety of preeminent musicians and composers such as Lannis Anakis, Ryuichi Sakamoto, Butch Morris, Kool Keith, also known as Dr. Octagon, Killah Priest from Wu-Tang Clan, Yoko Ono, and Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth. He also did the musical score for the Cannes and Sundance Award-winning film Slam, starring critically acclaimed poet Saul Williams. We hope you will join us for our upcoming lectures. Thursday, April 8th, next month, Manuel Delanda. Wednesday, May 12th, 2004, Ricardo Dominguez. And you'll find our past lectures and, in a few days, this one, online via video stream at the Digital Media Center website. We're passing around an email list. If you want to be informed of future lectures and events, please sign up. We'll guard your email address very carefully, won't share it with anyone. Please join me in welcoming Paul Miller.
Hey everyone, how you doing? Hope everybody's gotten settled in and you're all ready to kind of roll here. I want just to start out by saying it's a real pleasure to be here, and the fact that I can look out and see such a diverse group of people from all sorts of ranges and disciplines is hopefully a good sign of what Mark is trying to build with the multimedia kind of series he's building here. First and foremost, I want to just kind of highlight this discussion with a couple of ideas, and so I'm going to jump into things. But what I always like doing when I start these talks off is, just kind of getting people into a mode, so to speak. So just so you know, I'm not some academics who are going to be up here like going down to the last atomic particle and footnotes and everything. So it's a pretty relaxed and open thing. Let's put it this way: I'm an artist. I'm not a super hyper footnote guy. So with that said and done, I'm going to now partake of what we call artistic license. And with that, I'm going to kind of jump into things by, this little device, turn it off. So it's a movie, but it's a different kind of movie, I guess. So this is my trailer. What you're seeing behind me is one of my favorite films detailing a lot of the origins of early hip-hop. And it's a film called Style Wars, which is, of course, a remix and a pun on the infamous movie Star Wars. Style Wars was a documentary about the early techniques that a lot of hip-hop graffiti artists would use to what they call bomb the system. And, of course, in the late 70s, early 80s, this was a huge issue in New York's cultural landscape because young kids were trying to create an identity by appropriating public space for private expression. The idea here is that people were coming up with logos to represent themselves using that taxpayer-supported system we call the subway system. And so, we were looking at a conflict of public space and private expression. To me, one thing that's so engaging about this is the deep sense of personalization of stories that we're seeing here. People would go into very specific ideas around how to create names, logos, brands for themselves. And the more that you could get your tag up on the system, the more that the other people working in the system would be able to respect and/or consider what your work was about as a real thing. So the idea was to spread your message as far as wide as the system would allow, but also to have skill, technique, and the ability to create a whole series of new expressions with the vernacular. And I'm going to keep riffing on this word vernacular as I start. But I like this as a fun way to begin my lecture because you're seeing logos, you're seeing people creating a brand of identity and being able to create a sense of expression using a network. And what I'm going to be dealing with as an artist here tonight and walking you guys through is this idea of what is the new street, what is the new network, but the internet. So in hip hop, as Chuck D has said so long ago, hip hop is a verbal expression, it's electronic music, it's music of urban youth culture, but he liked to call it the CNN of youth culture. In its era, the subway system was the CNN of a certain group of artists that were trying to get their expression out. So I'm going to kind of be a trans-metaphor artist here by mapping one system of metaphors and one network onto another network. Today, these kind of situations and names and logos would now be a website. And each artist would probably be building their own style and trying to get a sense of expression off of that. So what I'm doing with starting my discussion out with that whole sense of being able to go from the early sense of, again, tagging, logos and stuff like that, and updating it. This is a recent series of logos I've been working on. So I come out of a culture, I went to school up in New England, a place called Bowdoin College, and did 2 degrees, one in philosophy, the other in French literature. And as an artist, writer, and musician, I always found that there seemed to be a cognitive disconnect whenever I went into trying to, again, map metaphors from one medium to another, whereas now mostly digital media has kind of rendered that all pretty much irrelevant. Once it's on your screen, it can be music, it can be a building, it can be an art form, it can be a sticker, it can be genetic engineering. But the same screen can lead to different expressions. So this is one of my current logos I've been working on. And you'll note, I'm hoping that you guys can kind of deal with the metaphor of, again, coding, again, vernacular coding. So this is DJ Spooky as a kind of a logo riff on the whole early Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns logos and targets that they were working with their paintings at a certain point of early modernist sort of Clement Greenberg, kind of American high culture. So the pun, of course, is only if you get it. If you're within a certain vernacular system and your system of reference is hip-hop, you might look at it one way. If your system of reference is digital media, you might look at it another way. You'll judge the font, you'll judge the style. Those trains that were going by earlier are a precedent. And so taking that same sense of tagging and being able to create expression and identity out of a tag has now migrated, to me at least, and for my artwork, into the internet. So these are stickers that another friend of mine, how many of you guys have heard of that sticker, Andre the Giant Has a Posse? Probably everybody, right? It's the face that's everywhere. It's the same face that's gone through certain permutations. And me and Shep Ferry, the guy who came with the sticker, we're very competitive. He stuck to the same sticker, and I kept changing my sticker, and that's what, that's the way, again, like tagging the system. So we go from the train to the sticker to the website. Hopefully, have I lost you guys yet? I tend to get very nonlinear. So to keep this kind of concrete, what I'd like to do is pass out a whole bunch of stickers and CDs that I brought with me. So if you guys don't mind, if you got a second, I always tend to find people relate to things when they have it in their hands. So I burned a couple hundred CDs of mixes and printed up a whole bunch of stickers. So feel free to take one or two and just pass it on. There's less CDs than there are stickers, so if you don't mind, take one CD, and stickers I don't mind if it's multiples. So this will go on as I'm talking, but essentially you'll get the idea of the riff and the pun and the metaphor. the image you guys are seeing is the what I call the Napster Black Power logo remix. You'll see you'll see what I mean when I get into it. But all right, so here we are. The first images you guys were seeing as this discussion was unfolding was trains moving in, again, a kind of a network. The whole idea here is that taking the idea of expression, conceptual design, and the ability to kind of think in what I call a transmedia format, it's all about the idea of creating artwork out of an archive, artwork out of a vernacular system where you're referencing quite a few very specifically encoded references to things. So in the 70s and the 80s, again, when I was a kid, I was growing up in Washington, D.C., went to school up in Maine, and one thing I kept noticing over and over and over was the distinction between quote-unquote high and low culture. So I want to start out at the second part of my discussion with a gentleman by the name of Vannevar Bush. No relation to the current dictator. How many of you guys have heard of this gentleman? Okay, a couple, cool. I always like kind of referencing Vannevar Bush at the beginning of these talks because this gentleman had a kind of a predilection for what I like to think of in the Derridian sense, you know, Jacques Derrida being, of course, the postmodern guy, fragments, all this kind of stuff. But this gentleman was involved with the early war effort in the 40s. And the US military was dealing with a huge volume of information that they needed to coordinate. And so he tried to come up with a system of coordinating the sheer volume of information, troop movements, material goods moving through all the US's military routes and systems. And he came up with a term called the MIMEX. And this is considered to be one of the first archiving retrieval systems that the US was kind of trying to figure out just how to deal with mass, huge volumes of information and coordinate and seamlessly move them along. So he's considered to be one of the precursors of the internet as we know it. The term he came up with was called a MIMEX. And let me move you guys into this. He was also a conceptualist, and some of the stuff he was dealing with was this idea of how to represent human information in a world where the uncertainty about information is part and parcel of what makes it work. So one of the devices related to some of his ideas was the voder, V-O-D-E-R. It's one of the first devices to emulate and indeed simulate the human voice. So, you guys, the voder, V-O-D-E-R, let me just show you guys a couple examples of it. Here we go. It was made in 1939, right before the World War. But the idea was to simulate a human voice, and the MIMEX later was meant to be an archive machine that you would be able to talk to. You'd say, I need this file, please find this file. And the MIMEX would have every file available that had ever been made on that particular topic available immediately, and it was meant to be a verbal recall system. So you talk to a machine, and 5 minutes later, a little magnetic tape or spool would roll out of a wall, and that would have all your information. So this is the origin of the idea of the emulation or simulation of the human expression. Let me just play this for you. And again, you have to realize this is extremely early, but you'll note as I play it how relevant it is now.
Will you please let the voter say for our Eastern listeners, good evening, radio audience. Good evening, radio audience.
So that's in 1939, a voice being played on the radio that's a simulation from a machine that was trying to figure out how to relate to people, or people trying to relate to the information they generate. Let me show you guys a schematic here of what this was about as well, because it's very intriguing in its own way. It's kind of become a metaphor for quite a bit of stuff. So what Vannevar Bush, and hopefully you guys can all read this, he essentially wanted to print books to record. Again, the idea of a record that was accessible by voice, being able to recall, coordinate, and act as a conduit between huge volumes of information. So the idea here was to create a precursor to what we now, of course, consider the internet. And me being, in New England in the ancient early 90s, I mean, it's funny, you guys are all probably hardcore computer wired or / wireless. And when I was in school, we barely had LexisNexis or Telnet, So you can see I'm an ancient grandpa compared to you guys here. 33, if anyone. So here we are in 1939 through the area of 1945, where someone is trying to figure out a library of 1 million volumes and how it could be compressed into one end of a desk, right? So we go back to that metaphor of someone having a simulated voice over the radio, you know, good evening radio, right? To me, one thing that's fascinating with DJ culture, and the reason I started out with those subways is going, and the way that people have painted their logos and ideas over them, is that the archive has changed. How we represent and indeed interact with the sheer volume of information in the 21st century is through the fragment, through the part, not the whole. And this is something, when I mean whole, it's W-H-O-L-E, not the band Whole, right? But no Courtney Love here. But to make a long story short, here we have someone acting as a precursor to a certain idea of an archive. And what I'm trying to kind of relate to right here is, guess what? My name as a performer is DJ Spooky. It's a funny idea when I started out in school around, you know what happens when you press play and there's nobody there? And you're dealing with all these fragments of information coming out of your stereo speaker. So, have I lost you guys yet? I tend to be nonlinear, so just let me know if it's too wow. All right. So we go from there, and this is the official start of my discussion here. So hold on one second. I use Keynote rather than PowerPoint. But has anybody here seen David Byrne's PowerPoint book? No? Okay. Well. All right. So, rhythm science. How many of you guys have heard of a gentleman by the name of Raymond Scott? Anybody? All right. Now, there's a couple names that I'm going to kind of riff on as motifs here throughout the discussion. First and foremost was that Vannevar Bush gentleman who came with this idea of the Mimex and being able to coordinate huge volumes of information. The second gentleman who I'm going to reference is a gentleman by the name of Raymond Scott. And he's considered to be one of the first composers for, guess what, cartoons and TV commercials. And again, the 50s, the post-war era, the Mimex became old news because, guess what, the US military started looking for something they called ARPANET, which eventually became the internet. But at the same time that was going on, television was going on, and of course influenced so many people's imaginations and indeed standardized the way people relate to the imagination. And I'm going somewhere with this, so I don't want to lose you guys, but all right, so rhythm science, patterns. Let me play you guys an example of one of the first compositions of electronic music for a TV commercial, and this is in the early 50s. And Raymond Scott, you got to imagine like how complex it was to compose. Say, for example, if Bugs Bunny goes like this, you hear da-da-da-da, right? You know, to write that out, notate it, and be able to compose music for a moving character on a video screen at that time was extremely difficult. Raymond Scott is considered a pioneer because he was one of the first artists to use video as a composition tool. So again, this is an early point in culture. Here we go. This is the first TV commercial with electronic music.
Now look what they've gone and done. This little blue tablet is a heavy-duty detergent. It's called Vim, and I've never had a whiter wash.
From the Lever Brothers Laboratories comes new Blue Vim, the scientifically pre-measured heavy-duty detergent that guarantees you the whitest wash you can get every time. Because the world's most powerful cleaning ingredient and the brilliant whitener are scientifically pre-measured in every Vim tablet. That's why you get the whitest possible wash every time. Not just some of the time, not half the time, but every time. Vim means no spill, no sneeze, no waste. Starts cleaning instantly. And new Vim is a low-suds detergent. It protects your machine. Now Lever Brothers guarantees you the whitest wash you can get every time. New Blue Vim.
Ford Motor Company switches to Autolite. Ford Falcon. Ford Galaxy. Ford Thunderbird. Mercury Comet. Mercury Monterey. And Lincoln Continental. Now specify Autolite spark plugs as standard equipment. They specify Autolite power tip, the first spark plug that cleans itself while you drive. It reaches deep into the intense heat of your engine. Lead deposits are burned off. It actually cleans itself while you drive. You get all the power and economy your car was made to deliver. Whatever make or model car you own, there's a set of Autolite power tip spark plugs, ignition engineered to power it properly. The spark plug selected by the Ford Motor Company for every car it builds. No matter what make of car you own, next time you need new spark plugs, Ask for them by name. Autolite.
Okay. Autolite, New Blue Vim, right? These are commercials that at a certain time and in a certain place were considered to be some of the first group large-scale uses of electronic music. The TV at that time was considered a compositional tool by the very, sort of industrial culture that we now inhabit and call home, right? So to compose images for that and also to be able to compose music to accompany those images was a very early art form. Let me show you the machinery Raymond Scott would come up with. This was called a videola. And you have to imagine someone being able to play music to that in the early 1950s. So this is extremely advanced if you think about what's going on with video and multimedia culture today. Raymond Scott invented the computers that were used to be able to make music to accompany the images and what they call sync to sound, S-Y-N-C. So this is incredibly advanced, but the guy actually made the equipment himself. Today, of course, that would be almost unimaginable. You'd have to be, complete, I don't know what, somebody, but not Stephen Hawking or something, I don't know. But, and the reason I'm pointing out these historical precedents before I really get into the meat of my discussion is, okay, Vannevar Bush, information, archives, huge volumes of information. Guess what? Nowadays we call it Google, right? Back in that time period, it was something at the very edge of the imagination. It was the realm of almost a science fictional kind of thing of being able to talk to a machine and have information come back. Or, the Good Evening Radio audience of 1939 is now an Apple iTunes kind of little module where you can have speak text or something, So we take all of this for granted. And at this time, for a gentleman to be able to make an electronic instrument to play along with images and come up with, again, a kind of a theater of television was incredibly advanced. So here we are in the 21st century with your average Missy Elliott video where she can pull her head off her body and say, put your freak on or something, right? This is now something we take for granted, and the electronic imaginaries come home to roost. So I'm going to just play a couple other examples, but before I get into that, let me just show you guys some current stuff. So hopefully this isn't at all too historical, and let me just see if we can hide Keynote for a second here. All right. One of my current projects, which I'm always fascinated with, is this whole sense of, again, globalization. So I just want to play you guys a quick example, and we'll just kind of get into it from there. This is an early Flash animation piece I've been doing. So here we go. Okay. So hopefully that gives you an idea. That was a track from one of my older albums called Rhythm Warfare. And again, I like the idea of having everyone put their hands on things. So what I want to do is pass out a couple of things. These are a couple of records, so I'm going to just kind of hand them off. This is how many of you guys have heard of Saul Williams? Hopefully everybody. All right. All right. I produced his last EP. This was called Not in Our Name. It was kind of an anti-war EP where I had Cold Cut. They're the guys who own this record label called Ninja Tune. Depending on who's in the audience, I might be dealing with a lot of Beatles fans. I'm not sure. But Cold Cut is a cool group. Okay. Ninja Tune is a good label. So, all right. Here's the Saul Williams Not in Our Name EP. This is some of my favorite records here. I always find that people kind of get into things, you know, hands-on. This is Mad Professor, who I just did a project with. This is Escape to the Asylum of Dub. And you'll note there's all these cartoon characters attached to the Dub sound system mixing board. This is George Clinton making copies of himself. It's a long story. All right. This is a very rare record Robert Rauschenberg did with the Talking Heads, and it spins, so you'll check it out like that. And these are a couple different records by different artists. So let's see, this is the project I did with Mad Professor and Lee Scratch Perry. So that's called Dubtometry. This is a very rare record, which is why I'm taking it out, of Marshall McLuhan. He recorded himself and a whole bunch of different artists and writers, each one reading different parts of the medium as the massage. So whenever there was a different font, you would hear a different voice. So he taped the whole recording session, spliced and remixed everyone talking, and made kind of a collage out of it, mixed with jazz. So I'm going to play elements of that in a moment, but at least want to just pass it around. Okay. This is one of my favorite poets. This is Nikki Giovanni doing The Truth is on the Way. It's a poem about sort of existential 60s feminist issues, I guess. But in light of what Bush is doing with choice, these issues still come back. So there's that. This is the 12-inch of Dubtometry. There you go. And this is Basquiat's first 12-inch. It's a project he did with Rammel-Z, who's an artist who's completely nuts, but hey. I like the cover because it's a metaphor around a lot of the idea of scratching. You'll know Basquiat in his paintings, especially on the ones that deal mostly with language, there's always words cut and scratched and kind of rendered to the point of legibility. You got to remember Basquiat started out as a DJ, and the way that he migrated into painting was on the crossroads of, again, music and painting. So you'll see in this one, the whole idea is about test pressing and versions and dub plates, which I'm going to get into in a little bit. But I just want people to kind of check it out. And you'll get the idea of the record the record cover sleeve is a kind of a blackboard of erased words. So that's an important metaphor. Again, language, erasure, and the idea of recontextualizing different images. This is Keith Haring's first 12-inch. You'll note it's all blank people who have similar forms who are kind of mixed back and forth with one another. And let's see. The Dubtometry project was a remix of the Optometry project. And I'm going very non-linear here, so I'm hopefully not losing you guys. Did everybody get a CD or a sticker? Hopefully sort of one of each and or both. Most people? Great. A lot of the elements on those CDs are taken from very rare jazz and rock recordings, but sampled, spliced, and cut up. And there's like lots of mashups, like, I don't know, Missy Elliott meets AC/DC, or I don't know, stuff like that. Anyway, Dubtometry was a project where I asked quite a few jazz musicians to play riffs and elements and then sampled them. And the idea was to be kind of jazz as a form of sampling, or sampling as a new form of jazz. So this is the vinyl, and I'm going to get into this software-wise in a moment. This is a project that was called Rhythm Warfare. This is my last sort of full-length album. You'll note there's all these kind of video game creatures dropping bombs in New York, and this came out in 1997. And there's 2 holes in the World Trade Center, which when 9/11 happened, my mom called me and was like, "Paul, look at your record cover," and I just realized, whoa, it is a video game. All right, these are 2 DJ Tools projects. And hopefully, as you guys kind of pass things around, you'll note there's a graphic design component, which I'm going to get into in a moment. But DJ tools are beats and elements that people then share amongst one another so that you can scratch and use them for scratch routines. So those are some of those. And this is one of the first records to really use loops and repetition. Afrika Bambaataa took 2 copies of an old Michael Jackson record and just kept looping it back and forth. And this is called the Death Mix. It's a very rare record, so please give it back. All right. 2 more records, and then we can kind of jump into things. This is an EP and a full length of my first album. It was called Songs of a Dead Dreamer. And I did this when I used to show with Anina Nose Gallery. And the idea was to take, again, fragments of mini records and create the idea of a social sculpture. So I took quite a few different styles of music and cut them and spliced them up. And this is 1996. This is the Japanese edition. So you'll note the cover looks like paint from the street, which is basically I took the material that they used to draw the lines on the street and used that for the paint. And this is the Synthetic Fury EP, which is based on sort of geopolitics and sound. You'll see it's a map of different sort of economic relations amongst different regions of the world, but each one applied to DJ culture. All right, so with that said and done, I want to jump into the idea of the story. So how many of you guys have heard of Alex Steinweiss? Nobody. All right. This is one of my heroes, and hopefully I'm not losing you guys with giving these people sort of name call rotation stuff. I mean, again, Vannevar Bush, Raymond Scott, and now we're up to a gentleman by the name of Alex Steinweiss. Alex Steinweiss was a graphic designer, and in the ancient early 20s and 30s, he walked into a couple different record companies and said, these cardboard record cover sleeves aren't happening, man. We got to figure this out. So you go to, usually if you look at the old records, they were just kind of cardboard sleeves with the artist's name. And so he's considered to be the inventor of the record cover sleeve as we know it. And that's an important design issue because you have to remember, at the time, radio was beginning to be more popular. And you're looking at the idea of a democratization of culture. You didn't need to go to the opera house. You could turn on the radio. You didn't need to go to the museum because you could get a postcard or what they call later versions of a daguerreotype. But the idea of the culture of the copy, being able to use multiples of things was beginning to become the basic mode of culture for the industrial 20th century. So the record represented a displacement of the performance. You didn't need to go to the opera, you had the record of the opera. In fact, you didn't even need to get the record because guess what, it was on the radio. So for the 21st century, you can think of the netcast, the MP3 file, the ability to kind of share large scales of information and files as an update on the record cover, on the photograph, on the radio. And on that same note of kind of dispersion, this is stuff like Friedrich Kittler will talk about. He's a German theorist of these kind of broadcast mediums. We're looking at, again, how the internet has reconfigured the imagination. And so the humble invention of the record cover sleeve, kind of was a shattering blow because the first people to really deal with the record cover sleeve, and again, this is why I passed out stickers earlier, is the idea is that somehow painting and sculpture and all these kind of issues where you go to the rich person's house and they have the Picasso on the wall or Matisse or whatever. If you have the poster of that or if you put the Picasso painting on a record cover sleeve, what does that make it? Does it become a multiple? Does it become a copy? These are issues again in the art world in the 90s. Matthew Barney being a perfect example. He was a filmmaker and sculptor who sold his films as limited edition DVDs. Whereas any of us who know about digital media culture, guess what? You can copy it in 2 seconds. It doesn't need to be a $75,000 DVD with a ribbon on it, right? And Matthew's laughing all the way to the bank, but nonetheless, the whole idea here is that copies and the actual idea of the original is under critique. It's under interrogation. And DJ culture has kind of democratized that process and brought it home to roost in a way that digital media, the same thing when you look at people dealing with what they call object-oriented software and coding, it's the same parallel kind of production process. You're looking at kind of Lego blocks of culture, being able to figure out what elements you need out of the archive, pull them up, use them to create your code or your image or your layered vector portraits in Photoshop, Illustrator, you name it. But graphic design, the idea of the remix, all of these issues are still with us in a way that artists in the 20s would find very familiar. Hopefully I haven't lost you guys yet, no? Yeah? Okay. As you guys pass the records around, you'll see the graphic design component has kind of migrated out of painting, out of the museum, and that's why I started off with the idea of what was going on with the network of the trains. So again, graffiti, logos, tagging, being able to have a system or a vernacular of reference points, all of those are about shareware culture, and in a way, DJ culture has become kind of a shareware value system. So again, it's about the economy of exchange. Let me show you guys two very funny websites that highlight this kind of stuff. One is, let's see, I Want a Famous Face. How many of you guys? This is shareware identity at its best. It's a very popular show on MTV at the moment. And MTV, it's a reality TV show where they find kids who want to have the face of various famous actors. So this is the shareware face, right? So they follow these kids around. Two brothers currently want to look like Brad Pitt, so they're remixing and sampling his face and putting it on theirs. So they follow these kids around through the surgery process. The camera goes even to the surgery room while the kids have surgery, and it documents it, and the kids then end up looking like perhaps, let's see, maybe a remix of Brad Pitt and Britney Spears on a Pepsi logo or something. But this is very real. It's very physical, you know. It's sampling taken home to roost, literally. So when you see or hear something that's part of your memory, it affects you, you know. This is what DJ culture is about. You might have heard a song in 1970 and you want to remix and riff on that song. Same thing, the same logic applies to someone else's face, your DNA, an architectural schematic for a building, you name it. It's a culture of quotation, and what I like to think of as the experience economy. So MTV, I Want a Famous Face, plastic surgery as sampling, right? Does this sound like too much of an outlandish thing? Well, let me take you to the next one here, because it gets weirder. This is one of my more favorite recent artists. This is a gentleman by the name of Steve Tanza. This is a man who has now turned his DNA into music motifs. So I'm kind of giving you guys some examples while I'm passing out my records as other examples of my own work, and I'm going to do a couple mixes just to highlight stuff. But so this is genomixer.com, where you can go and play with Steve Tanza's DNA and make his music out of his DNA patterns. So again, this is sampling. This is the idea of the remix. It's all about this idea of sharing, but not just actually sharing a sound or a record or an MP3 file, but your actual DNA code. So this is just the beginning of the 21st century, and I'm sure you guys, being, you know, bright students, these are all people's stories, and the way their stories, you know, get filtered through the various media and mediums. Literally, this guy's body is his own medium, just as with I Want a Famous Face is the medium for someone else. But these are codes, and these are codes of culture. But not just the code of, you know, whether you're watching TV or not, but the actual code that makes up your body. So what happens when that becomes music? It actually doesn't really sound too pleasant. So I'm going to keep moving. But anyway, the metaphor here is that this is code. It's not multimedia where you're sitting there and coming up with a new Flash animation file, but actually being able to try and understand the basic structure of what it means to be human in the digital information era. So I'm using DJ culture as a metaphor for all of these things. The remix, sampling, can be plastic surgery, it can be DNA code, but the metaphor holds. And you're looking at selection and found objects. So this is something Marcel Duchamp was riffing on in the same way that people like Vannevar Bush dealing with huge volumes of information. I mean, there's a couple million bits and pieces in your information making up your DNA here. These have all come home to roost. So with that said, and let me jump to a couple other things here. I always tend to find people relate to stories better. So let me just show you guys a couple different things. Just recently, I did a project with the Oakland Symphony Bay Orchestra. This is me on the marquee. I like seeing that one. The Paramount is one of the larger theaters in Oakland. And that's me with the conductor. And we're going, yo, what's up? All right. OK. So I don't know if everybody can see the resolution. This is me and about a 72-piece orchestra. The orchestra was playing various riffs and elements, and I had sampled them and then made vinyl versions of it. So this is riffing on Bolero and Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. I just did this last Friday, a couple days ago. So what I was doing was having the orchestral elements, scratching them and mixing them in, and having the conductor play with the rest of the orchestra by calling up the riffs by normal conducting and stuff. It was a fun project. About 3,000 people came out to the opening. It was fun. And on another note, let me just show, let's see. This is one of the larger festivals I played recently. This is, here's me spinning, right? And that's about 50,000 people out in the audience. So, hey, audience, right? And that's me and RJD2. I don't know if you guys know him. He's like, yo, Paul, this is huge. I was like, yeah, it's fun. The sound system was about a quarter mile high, so it was like you could scratch and it was like, vuk, vuk, it was this big bass woofers, right? It's got to have bass. So, so you go from mixing DNA to mixing crowds, and we see about 50,000 people hearing a huge bass woofer. And this is, I'm not exactly Paul Oakenfold or anything, but, the idea here is mixing as a basic sense of vernacular. So let me take you guys to a couple other remix folks. And again, this is all about just shareware culture, so I'm just riffing on things here. How many, you guys have probably all heard of Moby, right? Okay, let's see. I want to play you guys a couple of things here. This is a gentleman by the name of Scott Joplin, but played by a mechanical piano. So just to give you guys an idea, this is a tinfoil kind of thing with little punch card holes at the turn of the century. Right? So those riffs we all know. That was a mechanical piano. You had to crank it up. And believe it or not, Scott Joplin's playing was mechanized in a way that was then made into these kind of salon parlor machines. And again, these kind of weird tinfoil rolls. You get a shipment of a weird box, and you have to crank it up, and you'd have a mechanized Scott Joplin, right? For us, it would be a jukebox, or you'd go to a club, and there would be a DJ. So the pun here is mechanization, being able to kind of think about that, and again, 100 some odd years earlier. And let me just play you guys a couple examples here. Right? You guys all know that. But suppose I were to take the same riff and change it. Let's see, what do we got here? The motif, for me at least, is all about being able to understand the dynamics and change them. So here we are in the 21st century where all of these memories and the ideas are unstable objects of memory. Let's see. This is one of the first sentences.
Ooh, Lord, trouble so hard. Ooh, Lord, trouble so hard. Don't nobody know my trouble but God. Don't nobody know my trouble but God.
Right, so most of you have probably heard that in Moby's track, which is this remix of the same piece. That's a slave narrative, again, taken from the South. Remix taken from Alan Lomax's archive of all these recordings he did of plantation songs. And Moby sampled it and made it, I guess, become an SUV ad, maybe. So, here we go. Right? So that sense of the remix that I was talking about earlier, this is one of the more popular songs. And you have to remember, this album sold about 9 million copies. And it wasn't based on the actual vocalist. It wasn't based on, in fact, any recognizable essence of the vocalist. It's one of the first large-scale mainstream albums where no one even knows what the vocalist looks like, let alone knows what they sound like. In fact, the vocalist took someone else's voice and made that sell. So how do you understand this idea of presence and absence, identity, and being able to understand sampling as a representation of collage? The reason I'm riffing on this is because I'm fascinated with the idea of the uncanny, and in fact, that's kind of what Spooky was about. I used to go into my philosophy class and get into these discussions about, say for example, Hegel's notions of dialectics. So you could then say, well, suppose we take a dialectical approach to someone like W.H. Auden, or if we take the idea of how a composer will work with a poem or a song, or even just how we hear things. So let me just play you an example after the Moby. This is W.H. Auden reading a poem of Yeats, or a poem sort of in the memory of Yeats.
Far from his illness, the wolves ran on through the evergreen forests. The peasant river was untented by the fashionable quays. By morning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poems.
So that he's talking about the death of the poet kept from his poems. I'm using this as an example of like kind of the distinction between modernism versus postmodernism, and how, if you think about, let's look at the etymology of the word phonograph. It means phonetics of graphology, sound writing. So whenever you think of someone like, say for example, Lautréamont, the French poet, or Apollinaire and a lot of the French Imaginists kind of scene, or the early Surrealist scene, all those artists were dealing with the idea of the standardization of the imagination and trying to understand it as kind of a cut-up narrative. You can look at Mallarmé's poems, you can look at Lautréamont, and this is the French scene, or even what Debussy's ideas around, say for example, the composition La Mer, where he heard a lot of Asian music and applied it to classical music. So sampling has been part and parcel of the 20th century imagination, but when it gets to the 20th century, this is where the entropy really kicks in, and the uncertainty of origin, how ethnicity relates to, say for example, if you hear a South Asian song, probably most of you guys have heard of, let's see, Punjabi MC, right? Let me play you like gangster hip hop from India, and you can get the idea here. Right? So we have Desi crew in the house, hopefully. But you take the same version and do a different beat. And this is the Moby effect. So, how many of you guys had any idea what that person was saying? Right? Maybe one, maybe two. But the idea of a system of correspondences, this is something about franchise identity. This is about rhythm and globalization, and also about pan-humanism. And it's an issue that when you're looking at how music has spread throughout the world, DJ culture has been one of the ciphers for people to translate different rhythm structures and syntaxes to their own region, local style, and again, personal style, by tailoring and taking from the fragments of various archives and applying them to local situations. So that's why I was talking about the internet as a new form of the street. So the subway system that I started out my talk with the idea of the trains and correspondences and people trying to generate identity. You're looking again, public space, private expression. Digital media as a kind of a cipher of these internal, again, cultural issues as filtered through an information economy. Again, when you think about MP3 culture and the way people have been able to spread and diversify all sorts of different, again, compositional strategies, this is something that cuts across the creative act, whether it's architecture, DNA remixing, or even encoding files. The whole system is about selection and being able to translate across mediums. So as an artist, this is something I've been trying to figure out. And so that's where the spookiness comes in. How do you create identity as an artist and make a metaphor out of that, again, in a sort of a post-Warhol sense of copies of copies of copies. When you're thinking about that and what's come home to roost, generationally speaking, we're probably the first generation to really grow up with this as our environment. I read a statistic in The Economist a little while ago where they said something like 50% of the world's populace has never even made a phone call yet. So you have to really imagine that kind of riff, on technology, art, and culture in a world where most of us are living in a way that our ancestors wouldn't even be able to necessarily understand, except for the correspondences between the familiar and the unfamiliar. So 50% of the world's populace has never even made a phone call. One of my favorite science fiction writers, his name's William Gibson, he has a great phrase where he says, the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. So, so this is where you have a guy on a camel calling in missile strikes on the World Trade Center downtown, a guy riding a camel in the desert in Saudi Arabia maybe, or for that matter, you have some people in a village in India where there's one phone for every 300 people, being able to tune in to watch the World Soccer Cup, hearing it coming out of a telephone. These are things that artists, I think, are going to have to interpret as we move further and further into this kind of information and experience economy. Because to me, at least, the United States at this point, our best product is not products anymore. The only thing we really do well is produce more consumers. So maybe that's why Bush said go shopping after 9/11, right? It's just one of those strange inversions of the industrial reality we live in. So let me play you guys a couple other examples. I played you Moby sort of sampling someone else. But let me take you guys further back, because I'm talking about networks. I'm talking about history. I'm talking about interrogating history. This is Marconi's first broadcast of radio over the Atlantic. Again, radio was used to create a sense of collapse of distance. And let me just play this one last time. Here we go.
Of the Atlantic Ocean by radio, which occurred on December 12, 1901, when I had traveled the Stephen station. Next up, I have set myself at St. John's Little Land. I was able to receive a succession of 3 clips corresponding to the 3 dots of the letter S launched by the North Sea into space of Paul Julian Conway on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean.
So that was Marconi making one of the first transatlantic radio broadcasts from 1901. But you're thinking about, again, a collapse of distance, and what radio implied at that time has now come home to roost in the internet, where you can send a file so quickly. We're looking at the idea of the speed of light itself as it moves through the fiber optic cables as being able to condense the human imagination. Again, where Vannevar Bush had the Mimex, where he felt you'd be able to talk to a machine, to us, the idea has now come home to roost, that we now have a kind of what Deleuze and Guattari would call a machinic imagination. How we think about things, structures, files, surface level components, being able to pick and choose and pull and compile. These are issues that machinery were assigned in the early portion of the 20th century. But how do we, in a post-human, quote-unquote, era, think about that? Well, you know what? That's where the metaphor comes home to roost. Post-human, of course, who was human? And how many of you guys have heard of the 14th Amendment? Probably everybody, right? All right. 14th Amendment was after the Civil War and slavery. And it was meant to be a balance for the slave states, which had been previously the South, to be able to have the freedom of franchise for the slaves. And the slaves, of course, were then given what the amendment, what they call equal protection under the law. But most cases that came before the court at that time, again, this is right after the Civil War and half the country had been shattered, and the slaveholding states were in ruins and were, quote-unquote, occupied by the North. Well, the most cases that came before the Supreme Court were all about corporations claiming identity. And so the actual 14th Amendment use was actually constructed to give corporations identity as people. And so that's America's economic gift to the rest of the planet, was the actual construction of corporations out of the ruins of slavery. And so if you think about how that affected, of course, we live in the era of the corporate economy, this has now come home to roost. So African American culture and identity, especially in the post-Civil War era, was a kind of a crucible, a crossroads for both culture in the form of blues, jazz, all this kind of stuff that migrated to the North and influenced all of the styles of the other eras, but also in the way that corporations were able to claim identity, transform it, and use it as an economic platform to create, what they call larger economies of scale and production. So hopefully I'm not losing you guys, and this is not too nonlinear, but let me just kind of riff on one or two things, and I always find people relate better to stories after I get too theoretical, so. This is a remix of some very funny stuff I downloaded from fuckitall.com. So, hopefully this is one that everybody can get here. And the punning and the sense of being able to play with, again, public space and private expression. Here we go.
During these last few months, I've been trained by Al-Qaeda that I'm weak and materialistic. I told our country and I told the world, if it feels good, do it. I hope you'll join me in expressing fear and selfishness. We will embrace tyranny and death as a cause and a creed. We can be summed up in one word: evil. Committed to defeating not only the good work of charities, but the values that will bring lasting peace. And we have a great opportunity during this time of war to lead the world towards suicide and murder. Let's roll.
All right. So, well, whenever I get too theoretical and talking about this idea of the archive imagination and stuff like that, and playing with the found fragments of digital culture, I always tend to find this one is a good party trick, right? We can all relate to. So, the remix as a metaphor for 21st century culture, aesthetics, and values. Let me just walk you guys through a couple more things, and then Mark, what do you think? We should open up to questions, or how are we for time?
We have 20 minutes until we have to really turn it off and give you equipment back.
Okay, cool. All right. So here we are with good old, this is my layout board. Again, you got to think of what I call the Photoshop imagination, where you have layers and vectors. We just put this guy in a certain layer. I could also layer all sorts of stuff over him, but we don't have time, so we just keep moving. All right. So this is a gentleman staring at a very small screen playing a weird computer that he made himself. All right. All right. And this is a piece, again, the sticker that you guys all hopefully got was that. But again, the metaphor here is about play. So let me just play one other quick example, and this will give you guys a little bit better idea. So here we go. All right. So being able to sample, again, gestures, fragments, and being able to give them a life and breathe life into them is, again, what Freud would have called, again, at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, the unheimlich, the uncanny. And we live in a culture that's haunted by that. And again, the spooky metaphor was always meant to be a sense of humor about, again, pressing play and there's no one there. You're playing with fragments of a vanished presence. So here you see on the screen the remix of the Napster logo that I did a little while ago. It's a sense of humor. It's always funny. I don't know if you guys all know Sean Fanning. He's the guy who came up with Napster. So a very funny little short story I always bring up with this logo is that Sean has curly hair. And so he's a white guy, but because he had curly hair, they said he had nappy hair, and so that's where he got the term Napster, believe it or not. It's like sort of black, kind of joke, inside joke, there we go. But anyway, so you guys get the idea here, remix. This is the Black Power Napster thing. All right, there we go. What you're seeing here is one of the first notions of a standardized time. This is the Harrison clock from the late 18th century. The British Empire, like the American Empire, needed to be able to figure out ways to standardize situations so that you'd be able to send products and receive things, you know. This is their, I guess, their equivalent of the world on time. So one of my most recent projects was a collaboration with an artist named Julien Laverdier. I don't know if you guys all saw those, you know, the two beams of light where the World Trade Center was. Julien designed those. He's an old friend of mine. But for this project, we got the British Admiralty, which is, of course, guess what, where Greenwich Meridian Time is. It's based in Greenwich, England, not Greenwich, Connecticut. But they basically put a stethoscope inside the H4 clock and recorded the sound of the machinery of, again, standardized time. So I got a really high-resolution image of this H4 clock. The British created what we call longitude, again, you know, the world on a grid system, and again, standardized geographic time, and being able to reference and put together a map of the world based on standardization, which of course the internet has now inherited and made more and more entropic. But it was all based on the idea of a very specific time ratio of machine parts. So I got the H4 clock and put my own graffiti tags on each time. You can see at the bottom, is, you know, each number is a different graffiti tag. But again, when you think about when I was showing you earlier, the trains with all those different expressions going over them as a kind of a starting point for my aesthetic, hopefully this will kind of lead you to the idea of you know, subjective time. So this is graffiti in the post-structural kind of mentality. It also has a similar resonance to Japanese kanji as well. I don't know if there's too many folks from Japan or China, but it's my own language, So let me bring you guys here. All right. This is the United Nations model of the standardized time, and it's based on a 360-degree kind of rotation of the planet. Let's go back here. Me and Julian got the Miklos Pinther, who's the United Nations chief cartologist, to give us the map of all the different time zones. And this is a limited edition CD. By the way, all the images and sounds you're seeing, or at least most of them, not all, they're all downloadable from the website. It's djspooky.com. If you go to the art section, the stuff I was showing you earlier, most of it you can, again, the idea is that you can eventually make your own mixes out of all this stuff. So the world on the grid structure as the inheritor of the longitude. Hopefully you guys can see the blue lines were the demarcations of longitude that the British Empire came up in the late 18th century. The red lines are the games each nation plays with their time zones. So say, for example, if you're in China, you're on Beijing Supreme Time, so the whole country is set to this one clock. Or, I don't know, Pakistan and India really hate each other, so they put themselves about 15 minutes apart. You know, little things like that. But the blue lines are considered to be rational time. Longitude, very precise structures, and the red lines are irrational time or political time. And the way each country, say for example, Chicago, they made their own time zone because the farmers needed more time to get to the market. The US is on 3 time zones. You know, it doesn't need to be. As you can see, it's demarcated by a couple different versions of the longitude. Again, the blue lines as rational time. So I got the British Admiralty to give me the sound of the clock and made a mix of it. It's going at about 180 beats per minute. Again, 360, 180, so double. And the sound of the clock is downloadable from our website. But if you think about DJ culture, the hip-hop rhythm beats around 90 beats per minute. Drum and bass is usually around 180 beats per minute. So the pun, of course, is about world time as beats and pulses. So let me play you the sound of this clock. Okay, so that's the sound of the clock that actually set the tone for longitude, which again was the first notion of standardized time, standardized geography, and being able to all have, you know, again, a whole world representation going on, again, simultaneously. So again, that's a very poignant metaphor for how the internet has standardized a certain kind of perceptual time, We all live in that world of all at onceness, as Marshall McLuhan said a long time ago. On the screen behind me, you see the definition of the term pattern. It comes from the French term patron, anything proposed for imitation and archetype, an exemplar, that which is to be or is worthy to be copied or imitated. So again, the reason I was showing you guys longitude as a pattern applied to the whole world, it was a sense of how rhythms are patterns as well, right? If you think about rhythm, awareness, we as humans always seek out, the familiar, the idea of even a building as a series of patterns. And there's this very famous phrase from Goethe and Schiller, these two German sort of high romantic poets who say, architecture is nothing but frozen music. But suppose if we think of that as patterns, architectures and buildings are nothing but patterns, right? And we reverse engineer that term and we think of music is nothing but liquid architecture. And about patterns and about, again, consistency in patterns is my artwork. It's always playing with patterns in culture, patterns in memory, how these patterns can be applied to different cultures, which is why I was playing sort of the Indian hip hop versus W.H. Auden, and so on and so on. Here we go. Here's another pattern. So again, all of these gestures, all of these different fragments of video and gestures that I'm playing you, anyone could walk away and make any pattern out of that, right? This is just one I particularly chose with a group I work with called Eclectic Method. But if I was in India, I might take a tabla pattern and make a riff out of that. If I was in China, I might take a pipa, flute or something. But each of us is going to have our own cultural references and think about patterns and rhythms in an individual and specific way. But hip-hop was one of the first global vernaculars that influenced so many people that they all have responded to those rhythms. And that's what I'm talking about, again, African-American identity, corporate culture, and this idea of the franchise, idea of, again, equal protection under the law that have led to the identity of corporations. These are all just patterns. And, patterns can always be changed and altered, and you just figure it out and just dive in. So the idea here is that all of this is downloadable. And I'm hoping that people will walk away from this feeling like, DJ Spooky was here talking about sort of sampling a computer or sort of, but I want you guys to just walk away from this thinking it's all about patterns and how you play with them. And that nothing is cast in stone and that there's always an irreverence, whether it's your DNA, whether it's information, whether it's a presidential speech, or whether it's a painting. The idea here is that in the digital era, all these ideas of a modernist sense of permanence and static objects, these are all now being put under critique. So again, from the idea of the invention of the record cover sleeve that I've talked about earlier, to the idea of democratization of technology and art and aesthetics, these are issues that youth culture is dealing with, and this is what the idea of a culture of spookiness, if you think of, again, the Unheimlichs, the idea of standardization, which I've shown you the clock, and how each country plays with the clock. These are all issues that, for global culture, and again, digital media culture, in an era where only 50% of the planet's even made a phone call, it's something that's affected everyone. And let me just walk you guys through a couple more things. This is, again, the definition of rhythm as I just downloaded from dictionary.com a little while ago. It says rhythm here is a movement or variation characterized by the regular recurrence or alternation of different quantities or conditions. The rhythm of the tides, for example. The patterned recurring alternations of contrasting elements of speech or sound. So, you know what, let me play you guys a typical example of what I would feel like when I went into my class, in college, and we'd be talking about Hegel's dialectics. And my professor would be like, well, in the Socratic method and being able to understand how Socrates was a speaker, he would be out in the public square, and his philosophy elements and the idea would be able to be expressed verbally. This is the origin of rhetoric. And so I'd say, well, excuse me, sir, that sounds like Chuck D, a Public Enemy. And my philosopher said, well, no, that's urban youth culture. I said, well, Socrates was pretty urban too, right? Back in his day, sort of what they call the agora, being in the center of the Greek, town. Well, the agora for us has now become the internet. This idea of, again, public space, private expression. Let me play you a typical contrast of what I was, kind of a sense of humor. I used to have a radio show called Dr. Seuss's Eclectic Jungle. And so I'd walk into class and play various mixes of stuff. And it would always, I was a trickster figure for these guys, so it was always a sense of humor, but you know, deadly serious. Let's see if I can find one of these. I bought a whole bunch of records, some of which I've given out and people are passing around. But, all right, 1, 2. This is what happens when you have too many records, right? All right, I can't find Chuck D right now. That's too bad. All right, well, I will take McLuhan. Suppose, say, for example, you were just feeling like it, but you wanted to hear what McLuhan sounded like, and then we find a fragment of McLuhan on this record.
Pattern recognition. Recognition. Pattern recognition. Pattern recognition.
All right.
Our electrically configured world has forced us to move from the habit of data classification to the mode of pattern recognition. We can no longer build serially, block by block, step by step, because instant communication ensures that all factors are built by the guidance. Back to Victor. Back to Victor. All media work this over completely. They are so pervasive in their unsocial consequences that they leave no part of us untouched, unaffected, unaltered. The medium is the massage. Any understanding of social and cultural change is impossible without a knowledge of the way media work as environments.
So this is Marshall McLuhan in 1968, reading from The Medium is the Massage over a whole bunch of cut up, spliced up, tape-recorded loops of jazz, rock, and the idea of music as a kind of a theoretical backdrop. So I guess we can call him MC McLuhan, right? This is early hip-hop. This is actually someone rhyming over a text, being able to try and understand a structural engagement, and recording a beat, and being able to make a theoretical statement out of it. Let's play one or two other examples.
Which way?
About things. Very many value judgments or suggestions about what people should do about these things. For instance, Marshall himself says that all he's doing is describing, not prescribing.
Every new technology creates a new environment in which men live and work. The technology of the alphabet has movable type. Printing, 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 printing. Predisposed of predisposed us to think and act in certain ways. Printing extended the emphasis upon linearity. It fostered and encouraged the fragment. The process.
So, do you get the idea where he's talking about the idea of the alphabet as a kind of technology, and I'm just riffing on that in a very specific, quick moment. But the idea of movable type, the printable imagination, and the idea of a portable language, of course what he called the Gutenberg galaxy, has now come home to roost, where we're looking at each record as a kind of a vernacular, again, Lego block, and being able to pick and choose and mix different patterns of rhythms to come up with different forms of expression. So let's just let McLuhan talk here with no beat. So we're going to pull him out of a hip-hop vernacular here for a second. I doubt he would be able to hang in a battle with, say, for example, Busta Rhymes, but, we can try.
Just upon linearity. Certain way. Predisposed us to think and act in certain ways. Printing extended the emphasis upon linearity. It fostered and encouraged the fragmenting process. A process of specialism and of detachment, a habit of thinking in bits and parts, and step by step. Printing completely changed everything. It changed what men thought of themselves, how they behaved toward each other.
It changed systems of government, and so on, and so on, and so on.
So that's McLuhan talking about the idea of changing even systems of government in response to the printing press. And of course, we have two Martin Luthers here. Martin Luther, who was the Protestant who posted all of these proclamations against the reforms of the Catholic government, and we have Martin Luther King, who used posters and other things to, of course, protest against the U.S.'s racial policies of the South. But it's kind of a fun pun, again, mapping one metaphor onto another. One person's name, Martin Luther, someone who uses the Gutenberg Revolution to create an entire new religious movement, and the other Martin Luther who uses the same kind of ideas to try and create a different form of American social culture. So from one Martin Luther to the other, the riff, the remix, the sample, the printing press, all of these are metaphors for a culture of the copy. And again, since we've probably got to wrap in a little bit, I just want to say, you know what, at the end of the day, it's all spooky. So, one micro detail, if you can pass the records back. So we should just open this up to questions, I guess, yep? There's someone in the back,
I'm sorry, I missed the whole lecture 2000 stats class, but I was just curious to know your point of view on the impact of EDM and internet and like record labels going under and stuff like that, and where you see it going.
The question, I don't know if everybody heard it, was what did I think about the impact of EBN? Electronic dance music. And the fact that a lot of record labels are collapsing and people are downloading everything. And well, for me, it's an ironic situation because I think the major labels have to confront the fact that a lot of them are based on very flawed models in the first place. And a lot of the musicians aren't necessarily getting the same payment. So the money goes from where to who, you know? I like the iTunes model, and I like the way that it's been able to focus consumer taste. Like, you might not like a whole album, really. You know, a lot of albums, I only like one track anyway. So why do you want to drop $18.99 for a crappy album where you only like the single or one track? It allows for precision of taste that I think is far more in tune with the idea of the DJ metaphor in general. And I think people respond to that. It really creates a richer sense of culture, and it also creates a sense of activism and how people will then pick and choose what they actually really want rather than a sort of a top-down model of, you know, Clear Channel or, you know, Hot 97 telling you this is what you like. So the pendulum can swing in either direction, really. It's just, I definitely think that the major labels and this idea of the large-scale kind of pop thing, it's here for a while because they have the branding. They're, you know, once you hear that Outkast Hey Ya song, all of a sudden you just hear it everywhere, right? But that's because it's part of a very specific structure. Whereas you might not hear the next RJD2 track or the Talvin Singh remix of Natasha Atlas unless you really go look for it. All these are about how passive versus impassive you are. And the idea for me is not to press play, but to play. Does that make sense? Not to just press play, but to actually play. And that's where I think the collapse of the major labels is going to kind of create a lot more of these smaller, weird boutique labels, internet MP3 groups, file sharing network systems, and that's going to actually reconfigure the idea of, you know, music culture in general, probably within the next couple of years, if not now.
Use video game graphic at the cover of one of your albums. How do video games or visual representations fit into the whole remix?
No. Well, in hip hop, everybody has this metaphor of always going to the next level. You know, it's just a very ironic thing. It just feels like life and the way that we've imagined the idea of social hierarchy, the way people have internalized the mechanisms of game culture. If you think about the Indian game Kismet, I don't know, do you know? Have you ever heard this one? All right. It actually became what they call snakes and ladders because the Indians used it to be able to create a sense of living in a world of reincarnation where you were moving from one life to the next, and it was a teaching tool to be able to teach people about if you were moving through different levels of life. But of course, once it gets to the West, it becomes a game where it's snakes and ladders, and it's like, you know, you have to, you know, eat the Power Man pack pill, you know, in Pac-Man or something. And it becomes much more a model about consumer culture and the idea of kind of trying to always get more points to get ahead, and, you know, this kind of you know, social Darwinist metaphor. But the video game for me, and I use that motif in my artwork quite a bit because in the West, we're looking at a real parting of the ways between how people actually create, which they don't that much anymore, and how people use things. So it's about branding and taste and being able to understand the levels of hierarchy we see encoded in society. Music is just a mirror I hold up to society, and the video game motif. Say, for example, a great example, considering I played you the Bush remix earlier, is this tax cut that Bush has been dealing with. The actual reality is the tax cut only applies to people maybe over $300,000 to $400,000 income. But the rhetoric of what he's talking about is making it seem as if it's something that your average middle-class person can relate to. So again, the propaganda and the illusion has taken on a hold, whereas the reality of what the actual devastating effect it's becoming for the government and the ability to pay things, and you're looking at this huge deficit, a collapse of all ideas of Medicare, yada, yada, yada. Hey, you know what? The rhetoric, and if people see it on TV and if they relate to it, that's what the people are hoping will take hold, is the myth of it, rather than the actual consequence. So that's a game motif. It's like you're in a labyrinth and you're Pac-Man looking for the ghost pill, the one that makes you turn invisible to the other ghosts or something. So anyway, to make a long story short, whenever I make my record cover sleeves, I'm always thinking about what's going on at that moment. And I always do my design for my artwork and my albums based on both an idea of an artistic kind of statement, sometimes about painting, sometimes about computer culture as a metaphor for culture in general, or just for the fact that, I just remember when I was coming up on the scene and Shep was sticking with his stickers and he kept having that same image and I just wanted to keep changing my image. So, it's a sense of humor. Hopefully people get it, but there is a theoretical backdrop, and that's what I always try and, that's I guess why I'm here at Columbia instead of DJing at Crowbar tonight or something, I don't know. But eventually, you'll be able to press, a button on my website and I'll be a hologram and I'll be chilling out at the beach and the hologram will be here lecturing you guys. So hopefully that answers the question. Uh-huh. That's a great question. The idea was, or the question was, just to talk about collaborations, and there was the Dean of Architecture here, Bernard Schumi, is an old friend of mine. I did a mix and a video for the building, the Student Center that he designed for the Venice Biennale in Architecture. The mix was played at the Biennale. To me, collaborations are like conversations. I'm always trying to figure out some fun stuff, and sometimes when you're in a conversation with someone or a project, it'll take your artwork or your creativity to different places that you wouldn't normally go. So if I was just in my routine and making 12 inches and album covers, I might not get around to thinking about an architectural schematic, or because it's just, I'm too busy, I'm always, there's something else taking up my time. But if an architect friend of mine calls up and says, hey, you want to do a project, let's figure something out, then that'll all of a sudden make me start thinking about a different approach or a different idea to make something fun. It should be about art as fun. And so the Nest magazine, I don't know if everybody saw that. It's a very rare. It's supposedly on eBay now. It bids for like $500 to $700. But it was a limited edition CD I did for a magazine that's called Nest. It's a very artsy, esoteric magazine. Where each article, it was the idea of an acoustic magazine where I made a mix for each article. And you'd be able to kind of press play on the CD and listen to the article, so to speak. It was kind of more of an ambient mix in the same vein as like Aphex Twin Select and Ambient Works or something like that. But yeah, I do collaborations, remixes, production. So one of the more controversial remixes I did recently was this remix of Metallica, where I do music for movies a lot. And I did music for Spawn, which is just kind of very mainstream, but that went double platinum and sold a lot or something. It was like music for the fight scenes in the movie. And I did music for Scream 2. The guy with the ghost, and you go to some movie theater and there's this eerie hip hop music. That was me. So the idea here is, yeah, I do sometimes extremely commercial work and then a lot of weird artsy projects. Most of the visual material and the kind of record cover stuff that you're seeing today is all available at the website in one form or another. And the flag cut-up piece, for example, that's usually I use for my concert backdrop when I'm doing large-scale shows. So feel free to go back and reverse engineer it. And on the CD, for example, that I gave you guys, hopefully everybody got it. If you didn't, There's different versions of it on the website that you can download as either real audio or MP3 files. But the idea here is to make your own mix. So that's kind of the idea around most of my artwork. It's like the artist as shareware. Let's put it that way. Like kind of always figuring out. I work with many people simultaneously too, and I'm traveling and doing shows and projects. So.
Well, thanks, Paul. Unfortunately, the guys are here to pick up the turntables, but I want to thank Paul for a really interesting and dynamic kind of lecture. I hope you all come back to the next one. Again, that's going to be Thursday, April 8th, Manuel Delanda. Also want to let you know that if you're interested in this idea of open source culture and the different ways in which artists are working with appropriated material and the kind of increasing tension between artistic practices of cut and mix culture sampling and appropriation and the increasingly restrictive intellectual property regimes in this country and internationally, I'll be teaching a course on those issues in the fall. So if you're back in the fall, it's going to be a 6,000-level course in the School of the Arts. So let's hear it for Paul Miller.
Oh, and records. The records. Please give me my records back.